Okay, so we're looking at explore number 3, mechanisms for evolution. And the essential question we want to understand is how do natural selection and adaptation impact biodiversity? All right, so uh, draw out all your notes there, put the date, put your reference, write out your essential question, and hit the pause button. Tell me what you know or what you think. Okay, hopefully you took a moment to write that down. So let's just dive right into it. Natural selection. You've been learning about evolution. You've been learning that evolution is something that happens not in an individual, but across a population. Natural selection is a evolutionary mechanism that results in differential reproductive success. Okay, this is a mechanism for evolution here. So quickly, just to review, we'll start with letter A. If this is due to genetic variation, remember that oftentimes we talk about genetic variation in a population is a requirement, then these advantageous changes, right, these what we call adaptations, they can be passed on to future generations, right? So again, this is for natural selection. Uh, we're referencing genetic variation in population, and then those things can be passed on to future generations. Individuals who leave behind descendants are favored, as their genes will come to dominate a population's gene pool, resulting in evolutionary changes in the population or the species. And that should make sense. If you're reproductively successful, you get to pass on the genes. If those genes were useful, advantageous, then they should become more and more common, right? More prevalent as time goes on. Letter C, diversity within a species commonly arises when populations of a species are separated in some way. When you're dealing with smaller populations, you can arrive at more extreme, what we call phenotypes, the way you appear, these different traits, they can become apparent, they can appear faster. Sometimes they can also be the result of things like founder's effect and bottlenecking. These are examples of genetic drift. Okay, things that um, are especially amplified, especially obvious in small populations. Okay, and that can happen when you have a species that is separated in some sort of way from the rest of the group. They start to evolve differently, right? Eventually, the gene pools of these separate groups, these species, become so different that reproductive barriers are set up. The birds maybe start to sing a different song than the original group they came from. The two groups don't really recognize the mating songs or the mating rituals. Um, these are examples of behavioral incompatibility. And then sometimes you can just get right down to genomic incompatibility, where they just can't produce viable offspring, right? And as you know, if the populations can't interbreed, then you are considered to be two different species. You have speciated. Okay. Interestingly enough, different species compete for limited resources. Ultimately, traits that favor success in a given niche will be selected for. That way, you're not competing against other animals. Um, Traits become selected that allow you to be successful without having to necessarily compete with others. And this promotes diversity. This drives diversity. Okay. All right. Well, let's move into letter Roman numeral 2, the types of natural selection. I made a little note here for you. The following graphs would be for any given trait, whether we were talking body size, height, size of beak, the type of markings on your coat, whatnot. Okay. So there's three types of natural selection. There's the first type here we're looking at is directional selection. This is where a single beneficial phenotype is favored, increasing the allelic frequency to shift in the direction of that phenotype. Okay, some of these words you might be familiar with. You may recall them from previous studies on the subject. So when you have a gene for eye color, you your parents, your mom had a version of that gene, and your dad had a version of that gene. We call those alleles. Okay, different versions of the same gene. And when we have directional selection, what we tend to see is we see a particular allele becomes more and more common in the population it's being selected for. So in this graph, starting with the black curve, this may have been the average. This is what the population as a whole was demonstrating. Most of them were here. But as time goes on, you can see that curve either shift left or you can see that curve shift right, either direction. Okay, it may favor bigger, may favor a different color, may favor any number of traits, or it may not favor. It may favor the other direction. Okay, this is directional selection. Okay, the second type is what we call disruptive selection. This is where, again, in black, you may have a group that originally had an average, had a certain type of trait, but as time goes on, that trait, that intermediate trait is no longer preferred. In fact, in the population, you see the success is when you're either extremely to the left and you're extremely to the right, but not necessarily in the average middle anymore. And so your extremes develop and you lose that intermediate kind of trait in the population. And this, of course, is going to create diversity, right? When you've got now instead of just one common trait, now you see a couple traits that are common in the population. And then the last one is what we call stabilizing selection. And stabilizing selection does the opposite. It reduces the diversity. It selects for the average. It makes the intermediate form the dominant form, the most successful. So you can see where maybe we had a good number of organisms in the black curve who were on the left as well as the right, and some in the majority in the middle, but you had good representation on the extremes as well. And now in red, you can see that we've greatly reduced the extremes, right? There's barely any on the right or the left, but we have this high peak demonstrating that almost all the population now is favoring just an intermediate, an average trait. And of course, this is not going to increase diversity. This is going to do the opposite. It reduces diversity. All right. Well, that, excuse me, kind of covers natural selection, the types, and kind of gives you a little bit of context as far as the effects on biodiversity. So what I'd like you to do now is let's just go ahead and write ourselves a summary paragraph. And we'll catch up with you later, okay?